All right. Thank you all so much for being here at the last NL seminar of 2024. Today we have Rebecca Dorn, who is in Kristina and Fred's group, here to talk to us about how harmful speech detection by language models exhibits genderqueer dialect bias. So Becca is a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California's Information Sciences Institute, where they're co-advised by Kristina Lerman and Fred Morstatter. Previously, they earned their BS in computer science at UC Santa Cruz, advised by Lise Getoor. Their research focuses on the intersection between AI fairness, natural language processing, and computational social science. Lately, their focus has surrounded how NLP systems treat dialects of historically marginalized communities. And so please welcome Becca for our last NL seminar of the semester.
Okay, hi, nice to see everybody. Thanks for having me. As Katie said, I'm Becca. Also, I know a lot of you because you two are PhD candidates and students at ISI, so that's exciting. Okay, let's get into it. I'm going to talk about my recent work called Harmful Speech Detection by Language Models Exhibits Genderqueer Dialect Bias. I recently presented this at IAMA, which is a fairness conference that I highly suggest everybody look into. They also have year-long working groups centered on AI fairness, policy, and other really cool stuff. I'm a big fan. Anyway, yeah, so let's get into it. Before we start, also, as a content warning, we're going to be talking about a lot of reclaimed language, which involves a lot of slur use. I'm going to ask that if you don't have a connection to a slur, that you don't use the slur. Okay, so instead we'll say something like F slur, D slur, etc. Cool. Okay, let's talk a little bit about background. So transphobia and just in general, anti-genderqueer sentiment is very prominent in the US right now and also the world, but for the focus of this, we're going to be focusing on the US. Ideally, we would want content moderation to help stifle that harm and protect genderqueer people, right? There's a reason content moderation exists. However, we're seeing this trend where content moderation algorithms are seeming to disadvantage historically marginalized populations. So in one example, some structured interviews with TikTok users as well as Black content creators revealed this common notion that some identities are receiving more suppression on TikTok than others, namely Black creators as well as trans creators. And also in our own previous work, we found that tweets from users with non-binary pronouns in their biographies, consistently received higher toxicity scores as measured by the median than users with binary pronouns in their biographies. That's a really big problem, right? Yeah.
Just clarification. So this does this include with people who don't have any pronouns in their biography?
No, but this is a previous work. So okay. We can talk about that more afterwards, but I want to get into the nitty-gritty first, and then please give me questions. And also we're thinking about future work now, so would love thoughts on that. Yeah, so this potential to further disadvantage some groups can be really, really harmful for genderqueer online communities, right? We're this is one of those online spaces that makes me have faith in social media and the internet, right? We know that online spaces are used to play around with what it means to be trans, right? To come out, to figure out what is a comfortable, set of pronouns to use. Additionally, we've seen that online communities can help decrease feelings of loneliness and isolation through providing role models, validating experiences, and generally informational support for navigating health decisions and for educating family and friends. And finally, we know that social media helps genderqueer individuals interact with one another, which is really important in situations where there's a lot of in-person barriers, right? And also people aren't always out, right? So when there's not a lot of people in a single location, these online communities are really important. These are vital spaces, as it says on the slide. So in this work, we're gonna talk about these three research questions. First, how do language models treat genderqueer dialect when performing harmful speech detection? I say harmful speech detection very intentionally. This does include toxicity detection, hate speech detection, right? There's a lot of equating all these different words. Right now, I'm thinking of the umbrella of harmful speech detection. Second, can models improve this performance on genderqueer dialect by incorporating speaker identity context? And lastly, for reclaimed slurs, what is the role of keyword reliance in these harm assessments, right? Is the presence of a slur just overruling everything else that's there? Okay, so there's two prominent features of genderqueer dialect that have like some clear questionable links to toxicity detection, right? So consider this example tweet exchange. This was taken actually from a paper that found that toxicity detection scores consistently scored like famous drag queens as more toxic than like well-known white supremacists. So this interaction, these are all very famous drag queens, and it shows the two facets of genderqueer language. First being mock impoliteness. You may also have heard this called as reading, right? Like where many trans and just genderqueer people, right, use mock rudeness not to harm the audience, but instead to build in-group solidarity and resilience to future discriminatory experiences. And then the second facet being reclaimed slurs, where linguistic reclamation involves a non-derogatory use of a slur, specifically one that's like historically used against your own community. It's used, you know, to reclaim agency and identity, and so those are the two facets of genderqueer language that could be linked to toxicity detection. In this work, we're actually just going to focus on reclaimed slurs, although I would love to look more into mock impoliteness as well. Okay, questions so far?
I know it's hard to give an example, but what in this interaction, does it contain both mock impoliteness and reclaimed slurs?
Yeah, so like, if you look at this third one, Ramona exchange is like, oh, someone please sedate this old hag, I mean F slur, right? That's A, mock impoliteness of like jokingly making fun of your friend, and B, like using a slur that's historically been, yeah. Good question. Okay, so we're focusing on reclaimed slurs, but first we need to be like specific about what we actually want to happen, right? Because like, we don't want everybody to just be like posting slurs on the internet whenever they want, right? Like that's not the situation. So let's consider this example here. Dear God, I wish I had another D-slur coworker. In this situation, the speaker behind the text drastically changes what this means, right? Assuming that the person who posts this is not a lesbian, we would want like content moderation to be like, no, like please don't say that. However, if the person who's posting this is a lesbian, like the harm is not as clear, right? This post could be seen as harmless, and also to some people, maybe it still is harmful, right? But it becomes unclear in this situation. So what should the model do? It depends on the context, right? It always depends on the context. There's not like a one size fits all. Yes.
You know, in the harmful case,
Yes.
is the slur the problem? I mean, the slur is the problem, but that's not. But if you replace the slur with another word that is getting the same meaning across, would you not argue it's still a harmful expression?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
You're just not in the scope of the work.
Well, in the scope of the work, we're focusing specifically on instances that use that instance of reclaimed slur, right? Because yeah. Also, because in that situation, I'm thinking, I mean, I think that's a good point, and also is kind of like this one instance, how does it translate differently? We'll talk about that later, but that's actually a really good point. Okay, so for the sake,
So I guess this is really similar to a question that I asked on Tuesday, but let's say, you know, people writing tweets are not always going to prepend their tweet with author is a lesbian, so they can use the slur. Like, this requires that you're doing some sort of classification based on metadata about the author, and like how do you approach doing that classification ethically? And like, I don't know, there's especially about, you know, who is and isn't a lesbian, like that's very open area of discourse. I don't think that's like neatly categorizable.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that I can tell you my personal opinion, which is like not founded in research. My personal opinion is that like, if we're using a model to do this in the first place, we know that models are making assumptions about people's demographics in order to like sell them ads, right? So it's kind of like you have this context, or like what's your user provided biography, right? Who are the users that you interact with, and do they also like engage in queer community, right? And like we know that like social media companies could easily, you know, use those things and like within their content moderation system. That's my personal opinion. So take it with a grain of salt.
I kind of disagree with the premise that we actually need to know author identity to understand this post is not harmful, because I think there are other signifiers in this syntax that, like, as having interacted with a lot of queer communities, like I would immediately see like "Dear God" capitalized. There's just like that is a signifier to me that's like, oh, this person is probably queer enough. Overall, this is not a harmful comment. I think there's like, if I were imagining a hateful version of this comment, I could imagine other signifiers that I wouldn't say that like would tip the balance. So I think that this is actually like a tractable classification problem.
The "Dear God" part is the part that like signifies, and you don't think that a non-queer person would type that?
I don't think.
Okay, wait, I'm gonna pause this because, wait, no, that's really important and is something actually that we include later on in the paper. So on that note, I'm gonna continue, and I really love all the questions, comments, and concerns, and it makes me really excited, and I wanna have this conversation, but first I have to show you the rest of the paper. Okay, cool. So in this situation, it depends on the context. Just take that at face level for now. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to think of it as straightforward as possible for the model, right? Where we're going to think about harm in two different contexts. We're going to have A, harmful in, where this author is a member of that slurs neutral correlate group, and B, harmful out, where the author is not a member of that group. So in this situation, harmful out would be, is this harmful if the person is not a lesbian, right? Or is this harmful if the person who tweeted this is lesbian? Okay. So in terms of the data set that we looked at, we collected template-based short form text posts that include potentially reclaimed slurs, potentially because everything is subjective in this task. Yeah. So what we did is we considered tweets that were posted by non-binary users. When I say non-binary, I mean that someone who had non-binary pronouns in their Twitter biography. So we considered tweets posted by non-binary users that were judged to be highly toxic by Detoxify. Then we manually compiled those instances that include slur usage. To obtain the templates, we removed identifiable information as well as changed that token with the token slur, right? You can see on the right side what that process looked like. We resulted in 109 templates. It's not that many, but also it's a lot for humans to put together. Ideally, we will do this with more one day, but yeah. Okay, so then for slur choice, what we did is we translated each template into multiple unique instances by iteratively replacing that slur token with a slur from our list. Our slur list featured A, slurs referencing non-socially normative gender identities, and B, due to a strong overlap in identification, we included sexuality-based slurs. The slurs feature a range of positions in the linguistic reclamation process, right? Some of these we're referring to strictly as like F slur, and some are in the title of this paper. And also we intended to include pejoratives that target AFAB, assigned female at birth people, as well as non-binary people. However, most of those phrases were unsuitable for the grammatical setup of this data set, which is sad, but we continue anyway. Okay, this is where we're getting to what you talked about. So in terms of annotations, this task is super subjective, right? And like what I think is going to be different than what you think and the person next to you, et cetera, right? We could talk about that first instance for a really long time. So what we do is we recruited 6 annotators from Queer and AI, from a call for transgender and non-binary annotators. Each template instantiation was evaluated by 2 annotators. Yeah, in terms of annotations fields, we have 2 kinds of harm depending on that author identity context. So harmful in, is this post harmful given that the author is an in-group member? B, harmful out, is this post harmful given that the author is an out-group member? And then for downstream analyses, the annotators also assessed whether that text included a clear indication that the person is an in-group member, right? So just like you said, then later on we're going to reason, right? Like you would hope that models would be able to make sense of something like that.
Just based on a single text, not in any kind of like extra tweets, etc.
Yes, exactly. Just the single text. The 2 annotators have backgrounds in computational linguistics, and they also included an additional label of what context the slur is being used in, such as recollection, which is recalling a time that a slur was used derogatory towards yourself, self-label, labeling yourself with a slur, other label, labeling somebody else with a slur, more. And there's a lot of them. We're not going to go into the nitty-gritty, but we can later. Yeah, and so that taxonomy was based on a taxonomy developed on Reddit comments like that use pejorative language. We tweaked it a little bit to allow for more space for reclaimed language. Yeah, cool. Okay, this would be an LLM paper if we did talk a little bit about prompting, right? So what we did is we considered toxicity classification models as well as those text generation language models. In terms of the text generation models, we included 3 different prompting schemas, each adding a bit more context to the model's input than the last. On the right-hand side, you can see what like the final one looked like with all levels of context. So the vanilla model would just consist of this definition of harm, which is also the same definition of harm we gave to the annotators. Then the definition of in-group and out-group, and then finally the text definition, and then an input post to annotate. In the second level, for identity, what we did is we added a statement before the post that just says an in-group member tweeted this or an out-group member tweeted this. And then finally, identity chain of thought is where we included chain of thought examples into that reasoning process. Yeah, the chain of thought examples also were not in our data set.
So the group data is from your metadata at that point, like that's scrambled? Or that's from the annotators?
So we have these templates, right? And then basically what we consider, we get annotations for each instantation of is this harmful if it's written by an in-group member, and is this harmful if it's written by an out-group member? And then the model also scores each instantation for both situations. So each one of them, like it has a true value, but also we're considering.
But if you're testing both sides and seeing what the model says. Right?
Yes.
Written by in-group is a harmful, written by out-group is a harmful.
Yes, and it is synthetic, but it's also based on actual
Yeah, I'm
tweets.
saying, like in actuality, like.
Yes. Yeah.
Thus, there is no truth, and thus you can vary the truth.
Yeah.
You can be synthetic in the text and be synthetic in that.
Yeah, I choose the truth.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, questions so far, and then we're gonna go into results. Yes.
Maybe this is not that helpful of a comment, but why did you go with an annotation approach rather than more of a weak supervision approach or like if I were to think about this problem, I would consider like trying to look for explicit callouts or something else online in the interaction pattern that I could use as a weak supervisory signal. For harm. For harm, yeah, and then the lack of a call out would indicate like no harm. You know, yeah, why annotation? Because I mean, as you mentioned, there's so many issues with annotation and so many subjectivities with annotation.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that this task in particular, I feel very strongly about having a human annotation component, particularly because we're in that nitty-gritty of like, we're asking the question, like, is a computer going to obfuscate like what the harm is, right? Doing a weakly supervised approach, if we were to say limit it to just like those call outs, then we're inherently going to end up losing the like more confusing ones, right? Or like the self labels are not necessarily a call out, right? And like that is the part that we're concerned with in the scope of this work. Does that make sense? Okay. So the first annotation results, I found this really interesting. I found all of the results really interesting, to be honest. Obviously, because it is the paper I worked on. So anyway, what we did is we just broke down the distribution of slur usage, specifically with respect to group membership. So like for the instances with self-label, what is like the distribution of harmful within and what's the distribution of harmful without, right? As a way to kind of gauge when are things acceptable, unacceptable. We observed, first of all, this intuitively makes sense that in-group membership is a strong predictor of a harm score, while 15% of harmful in instances are labeled harmful. 82% of harmful out are labeled harmful. That's just across the board, totaling all of the annotations. That's a really big difference. And it also makes a lot of sense, right? Yeah, specifically for the in-group posts, we saw that for a lot of these situations, like almost across the board, annotators say that it's not harmful to use a slur in this context. However, that's not true for group label, where you're labeling a group with a slur, other label, where you're labeling one other person with the slur, and sarcasm. The implication that I get from this is that in-group uses of a slur can still be considered harmful when you're slurring somebody else, right? Just because you're a member of a group doesn't mean you get to call other people a slur. However, it's not like a total full, yeah.
What's the inter-annotator agreement on this?
The inter-annotator agreement.
I guess I'm curious how much difference there is between the annotators on how, like how offensive individual utterances would be.
Yeah, I don't remember actual number. For when we consider model results, though, we only consider instances with some semblance of annotator agreement because this task is so subjective. So if someone said harmful and someone said not harmful, we throw that out. But yeah, just to narrow the scope of like situations where it seems like there is a clear answer.
These are like complete agreements or like overall majority agreement. How is it like? How do you decide which ones to filter through to the result?
So this one is all of the annotations. We don't filter any of the annotations for this one. We're just looking at labels by slur usage, by what way that a slur is used. Next, when we consider the model results, it's like unfair to expect a model, like if we can't decide whether something is harmful or not, then like how are we going to ask a model to do the same, right? Like humans disagree. So to narrow that, we only consider situations where the annotators agree with each other.
So everything here is double annotated? Triple annotated?
Yeah, double annotated.
Double annotated. So we're seeing kind of double the data kind of in effect here because everything is counted twice.
Yes, but there are two different annotators
Yeah.
for each instance, right? So they can
change. If it's the same annotator, label everything the same. And whatever, yes, so.
Yes. Okay, cool. For outgroup posts, we see that the categories that are less likely to be considered harmful are recollection, counter speech, as well as quote, discussion of slur, and discussion of identity. The implication here, right, is that outgroup use of a slur could be acceptable when you're using it in a non-disparaging way, right? When you're responding to somebody else using a pejorative in a bad way, if you're quoting something, if you're talking about the dynamics of slur use within your community, right? Then sometimes it's a little bit more up in the air. Okay. Model results. So again, the task is so subjective and it doesn't make sense to look at all annotations in a task like this, right? So we only consider instances with the semblance of annotator agreement, as we said in the last slide. A lot of these results are unsurprising, but some of them are really surprising. Again, it makes sense because I am the author. Okay, so across all models, we saw that instances with reclaimed slurs by in-group members receive high false positive rates. We can tell, by low precision and high recall. This is not surprising. It's just not surprising, specifically in like vanilla, right? We see the F1 is like not good. The best performance over all models is achieved with chain of thought prompting, but even in that scenario, the performance is not good, right? We see Mistral gets like 0.53 in the best case scenario with chain of thought prompting. That's really, really bad in terms of like whose voices are being labeled as toxic and whose content is being moderated, right? In terms of harmful out, in a surprise twist, we see that Llama 2 and Mistral obtain their highest F1s over this whole right side, specifically with the chain of thought prompting schema. That's really, really cool. I feel like typically we see that promoting fairness leads to a reduction in accuracy in F1. So this is something that was very exciting to me to see that like, maybe there are some ways to like increase fairness and also increase accuracy at the same time.
It seems a pretty big jump for GPT 3.5. Do you know what that one's particularly different from Llama 2 and Mistral?
No, I don't. We spent a long time looking at it, but to be honest, I do not remember what we found. But that's a really good question.
So every tweet has a slur, right?
Yes.
And, as you said at the beginning of the talk, right, like it's sort of a presupposition that like you shouldn't be using a slur if you're not a member of the in-group and possibly not even then, right? And most don't do that, right? And furthermore, we know that like detoxifying perspective are very keyword based, right? Yeah. So it's really interesting that in the harmful out case, like I would kind of expect them to maybe not have the best precision, but have pretty good recall because like, so we're gonna always flag it. And yet it's actually it's the other models that are able to do a better job of I guess capturing cases where there's a slur possibly not perceived as a slur by and not on the naughty list by detoxifying perspective. Right? Is that just that aspect of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like again, the slurs we used were like all like we include the word queer, right? And then we included a lot of words that like none of us are going to use in this room right now. And the like case of queer, right? If you're like if you're so reliant on keywords, then like when it is used in a derogatory way, still like is the model just going to be like, no, it's fine these ways. But queer.
Yeah.
I think it's fine, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I haven't seen that kind of feedback. Since you-
I mean, well, then you're not deep enough in the internet, John. Like there definitely is active discourse, but I would say that like the majority of, and it's also like
I think this.
age based, but the majority of like Gen Z queer people are relatively fine with it being used in mixed company, but it's very much an active area of discourse.
Got it. No, I'm in the nerdy area of the internet that says that non-Jews shouldn't talk about Genesis. That's us. All right, go on.
We all need to go outside, world. Okay, but also great point, which brings us to our next slide, which is the question of like, how is a model supposed to know, right? Like how is a model supposed to know? So we look at instances just where annotators agree that the text includes a clear indication that it was written by an in-group member, such as not all D-slurs do coding and stuff. Some of us are actually really dumb. By saying us, right, you're implying that like the person who's speaking it considers themselves a member of the group.
So, and you define like clear indicator as like a semantic indicator, not like necessarily like a kind of discourse marker or like,
Yeah.
I guess like it's based on semantic meaning, not on dialect.
Yeah, not based on dialect, especially because like you can use queer dialect and not be a queer person. Yeah, so specifically like a clear indication that considers yourself one. Across all models, the F1 yielded, it completely dropped on these instances. Like it got way worse than the original model results, right? We see that in the best case scenario, we get an F1 of what, 0.24? Like that's insane. Sorry, I get really mad about this part. But the part that's crazy to me is that large language models, like what this shows me is that they're not effectively using in-context clues in order to adjust their understanding of the slur use, right? Like people are excited about large language models because of their like ability to leverage context in a way that text classification methods like often fail to, right? And yet in this situation, we see that like when the text includes an indication calling yourself a slur, it drops. And like, that's really scary to me. Yeah, that's really scary to me. And then which brings us to the final result that I want to talk about, which is what is the reliance on slurs and like, does our prompting schemas change that result at all? So what we do is we learned a linear regressor to measure correlation between model harm scores and the slur featured in the text. All of our results were p less than 0.01. If you want the nitty gritty, you know, we did like a one hot encoding of the slur presence, added a disturbance term, and also removed one slur to prevent that linear dependence because, yeah. Okay, so this plot shows the R-squared values from that, which is basically the correlation between the slur being featured and the harm score. So the darker the value, the higher the reliance. We're interested particularly in the trend that goes from here to here and then vanilla to over here. And like, does it get lighter? Does it reduce that reliance on those slurs? We see that our vanilla prompting scheme has a very high R-squared value, higher than our human annotations, which we have at the top there. Yeah, which is the implication here is that like the gold labels are like barely explained by slur use. However, at the same time, the vanilla prompting schema yields like a very heavy reliance on those slurs as key terms. However, on a more optimistic note, we kind of see that as we like add things into our prompting schema, the choice of slur becomes less explanatory for harm score. In other words, like we can make things a little bit better, right? That reliance on keyword goes away a little bit as we add things into the prompting schema. It's easy to just get really scared and sad in AI fairness, right? So it's like very exciting when you can do something to make things a little bit better. So that is something that excites me. Yeah, okay. Results overview, but questions, comments. So just again, as an overview for our results, we saw a lot of false positives for reclamation across language models. Harmful speech detection yielded high false positive rates on text featuring non-derogatory uses of slurs, often called reclaimed slurs, right? The second thing we saw is this inability to leverage context. When the model was presented with context through in-text membership indicators, even when it was included the in-text membership indicator and an explicit identity information in the prompt, right? The model showed little to no improvement, and in fact, it was worse than overall, is what we saw. And lastly, we see this keyword dependence where off-the-shelf models produce harm scores that are heavily influenced by the choice of slur itself, regardless of how it's used. This can be somewhat ameliorated with chain of thought prompting. In terms of limitations, there's obviously all research has a million limitations. Just before we can talk on a little bit is the template format, right? We know that template data sets are inherently limited to a finite set of sentence structures. We'd love to build on that. Gender definition, in this situation, we're grouping non-binary people with trans people with drag queens all under the terms gender queer. That is not, that's how we chose to operationalize it in this situation. And as gender continues to change shape and form, and excited to see how research continues to grow with it. Harm subjectivity, we talked about this a lot. The gold labels are heavily affected by who is our annotator, what is their experience, right? To promote reliability, we analyze model performance only on those instances with some annotator agreement. However, I would love to do this again with a completely different set of annotators and see are the results just completely different. And then finally, we only consider English tweets and pronouns. Obviously, most all languages contain speakers with genderqueer identities, and I would love to see this work continue elsewhere. But the big thing that I really want to be taken away from this project is just the need to consider minority group dialects in harmful speech detection. If we want to create inclusive online spaces for all, content moderation practices just need to include adequate representation of historically marginalized groups, specifically or including genderqueer groups. Toxicity models need to move beyond keyword reliance and leverage in-text contextual clues. Otherwise, who are these content moderation systems even for, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. That was that. Thanks.
Question. So in the in-group, out-group annotations, what is the in-group, what is the out-group? Does it change by tweet? Is it decided by the annotator on what they define the, is there a provided definition of what counts as in-group, out-group? To what extent is there layers of intersectionality that's considered at an annotator or at a study level, definition level for what counts as in versus out?
So if we think about this example here, this is what the in-group is, the second labeled here. It's the neutral correlate, which is the non-slur term to describe the group that's being referenced by a slur. That's going to shift by slur. It's going to shift by person, right?
So sometimes the slur is a little bit less specific, right? What do you do in those instances, right? I don't want to say the word which makes the discussion a little difficult, but I imagine there are definitely I guess with that example, it's a little clear, but it feels like not all slurs can be so easily mapped onto exact a clearly delineated identity. And yeah, I guess and also who does this? Is it each annotator on each example decides what the in-group is, or do you provide the neutral correlate to the annotators and tell them that's what the in-group is?
I'm curious which term you're talking about.
I think the original tweet talked one, I think queer, right?
Yeah.
I've heard it used in various contexts, right? And from the discussions I've seen, there are many ongoing definitive questions on how far you extend your definition of the word. I've seen some people in the queer community extend it even to things that many other people would classify as kinks. I've seen some people who are more restrictive, right? So I guess it's I think that's a good example for me where I don't know what an in-group at a more objective definition is. And given that if there is some subjective choice, at what level is that decision being made? Do you make it at the description level and give it to the annotator, or does the annotator make that decision themselves?
This is another good example, right? Like,
Yeah,
Yeah, so basically,
actually, I think that's a pretty big one because what is the neutral correlate of that?
Right.
so what we give, first of all, if you figure out the answer to these questions, like, please let me know. I'm sure a lot of people will be, everybody's gonna push back, right? In terms of what we gave the annotators, we specifically just said, is this post harmful given that the author was an in-group member? So just meaning, given that the author has some relationship with that term, right? But yeah, you're right on the nose. Or on the money. I don't remember which is the, okay.
So I have a question. If you go to the slide with like the horizontal bar charts, what is this like? What are examples of an out-group member using a slur for a self-identity? Like,
Yeah.
that to me doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, it's like the situation where like where some of the instances like have those clear in-group like indicators, right? So like if like a tweet is like, I am a D-slur and I don't care who knows, right? Like it's like we're kind of just considering it in the situation where it is written by someone who like it does not identify with that term at all.
Like the front ones, and thus I am a D-slur.
Yeah, like something like yeah. And we did see things kind of like that where people.
What do you take me for? Do you think I'm?
Oh, then, yeah, it's kind of a sub-label, right?
Or does it, in your addition, does it get classified as self-labor?
I think we only considered instances where annotators agreed that there was an implied in-group because I don't know for that
Well,
one.
what about the negation? I am not a D-slur. Is that, how would you label that?
I wouldn't label that as,
Well, how would you?
oh, in this situation, self-label, no? Or would it be,
So I would go sub-label, I'm not a D-slur.
or maybe counter speech? I don't know. What would you do?
I don't know what the definition is of counter speech.
What do you know? Oh, good question. Good
Should we
question.
provide annotation data, please?
Yes. Also, we manually resolved like the disagreements for this specific aspect.
So imagine a different study where instead of using slurs that were potentially hate speech, harmful speech, instead you have specifically non-slurs. So like, you can cause harmful speech with like nuance or whatnot. So I'm wondering, let's say, okay, so you have a bunch of group posts. I guess I'm wondering whether you think the results would be kind of like the mirror of this, whether they would basically completely be missed, or is that a strictly more harmful, strictly more difficult task, right? Like where basically you remove the slur entirely, but you still have the same ecosystem of sometimes it's harmful, sometimes it's not, because it depends on who you are, it depends on the situation.
We did collect annotations for that actually, in terms of limiting the paper, the like flow of like reclaimed slurs, right? Like made sense for this one paper. But I am also interested in seeing the results, and I actually forgot that we collected this annotation, so I'm gonna write that down.
Just like to maybe make it a little bit more concrete, like you could use like metonymy, right? So where you, in other words, you use like Subaru drivers, right? Talk about Subaru drivers, right? Like there's cases in which that thank you. Well, Katie, you've include me in more. No, that's emotion already. But like, right, like you can imagine a harmful description of somebody driving the Subaru that is relevant to their identity versus a non-harmful one.
Yeah.
So I'm just, I wonder what you think would your results would look like if you were to limit to that. So anywhere, all the difficult things were resolved.
My personal guess, this is not grounded really in anything, right? Is that I don't think harmful if in would change very much, but I do think harmful if out would change. I do.
Just the annotation.
Yeah, I think that we'd see more things being labeled as not harmful.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think that like, especially if you take like, I don't know, Subaru drivers, right? Like that's trivially factually true in many cases. But if someone on the street were to call me a goddamn Subaru driver, I'd just be like, that's so strange. I don't even really know how to classify it. Like I really need a fourth category of like not harmful, uncertain, harmful, really weird.
There were a couple templates where the editors were like, what does this mean? And we had to remove them because they were like,
Maybe just rude in general.
I love working with social media data, you know? In terms of next steps, what do you guys think I should do?
What we should do next is take a question from Zoom. So Nathan Bartley asks, or says, this is really interesting work. Is it known how these toxicity models get used in trust and safety at major platforms?
I don't know. I really wish I did know. Yeah, I know that like at least a couple years ago, Google was like heavily reliant on keywords for content moderation. I'm assuming that, well, we're seeing an increase of people using text generation models, at least in the computational sphere, right? Where like we know in computational social science and stuff that like toxicity models are being used to like make claims about behavior online. So in that case, we know that toxicity models like have some weight. I think of toxicity models as like a proxy for content moderation. Hopefully we get like some increase in transparency, right, in the social media companies and like what they're really doing with content moderation, because it's typically like listed as like a long-winded list of just like unacceptable behaviors and not necessarily like actually what the model is, right?
Who's the person that was working on check moderation? Did you talk here? Oh no, this was a maybe. Right. Okay. So I know that somebody like with the How to Nice group in Maryland is working on working with mods, right? To see like how can you make moderation of groups more effective, right? So,
right.
And we see in like Facebook groups where people have like, you know, you get these problems where the group gets kind of like on warning just because they use a lot of toxicity. What is auto classified as toxicity?
Yeah.
Or possibly they get complaints. Yeah. Anyway, so you know, presumably like queuing up, like what is the stuff that you should look at to figure out, like to make a human judgment about whether or not you need to like warn a person, ban a person, or something like that is the application of a better model, right? And so I mean, if you want, I guess I would say like to your thesis statement of the talk, right? Like you want to make the world a better place for otherwise marginalized communities to gather online where there has been effective communication. Probably auto moderation is not like in fact, there's reasons to suggest that auto moderation would never be a solution, even if you had perfect modeling, because the actual act of moderation is itself an in-group like nesting, but like it's a way of being social, is to be part of the moderation team and to like interact with people. And so,
sorry, were you finished?
No, that was a super long aside, which is to say like never don't say we want to replace moderators, because moderators want to do it. But they definitely don't want to be overwhelmed, right? And so, like, what can you do to ease their burden? Which it starts to get into HCI issues, but it also starts to get into like, you could just have a high precision model that is also nuanced, right? To like flag things that you might not otherwise notice, right? I would say like special purpose approaches that like work with the community. Not just the identity community, but the social unit community is like seems to be most productive.
I think also like that question of like, is content moderation something that should be done by a model at all? Is like,
I would say to do 100% done, no, but that doesn't mean like it can't be involved.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think you bring up like an interesting question and an interesting distinction between like community moderation and I guess like platform centralized moderation. Because like I know like Instagram and TikTok, if you hit like report comment, it just disappears into some void somewhere.
Yeah.
So like I think that like I was thinking of your work more in the context of centralized moderation from like a content team or whatever, but you bring up a great point about like better interfaces and better queuing for human moderators.
Yeah, I'm a little bit I'm a little, I guess, like worried about non-private marginalized community gatherings, and like, well, I guess my own preference is to be in a private space with my community rather than to like let it get invaded, and like that seems like it's inevitable if you're not. But it's just at least my own purpose.
Yeah, that's something that at Kristina Chance's talk on Tuesday, one of the things like that they slowly were finding is that people were like, I only want to use like a slur that references my group when I'm with that group, right? Like, I don't want other people to think that means they get to say, I don't want you to laugh at like that use, right? Which also, yeah, totally gets confusing when you're like on the internet and also, yeah.
I wonder if you have examples of the chain of thought threads, like they seem like they are actually quite rescuing to the performance, at least in these slur cases.
Here's one example. Can you read it, Rebecca?
Not too well, but that's also okay. That's a response. Okay, the text is written by okay.
It's like an analysis before putting out the label, right? So like in the non-chain of thought case, you don't do that, right? You just put out the label.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like a single step chain. You're not like you're not doing like a React kind of thing where you then go and like get more stuff.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I just wonder how. I mean, so you make the argument in kind of the last figure that this is an exciting direction forward because there's a little bit of, I mean, from what I saw, there's like the reduction in correlation between slur usage and classification accuracy goes to almost human levels when you use chain of thought.
Right.
So that seems pretty promising in terms of reducing reliance on a slur. I can't remember the overall accuracy results for chain of thought, but I feel like
Better, but not
right.
Good.
Okay.
Does that mean that it's just getting random? It's no longer correlated on the slur presence, right? But the results are not like that much stronger.
I wouldn't say that the results, for at least for GPT and Llama, do get better. However, it's not like, so I don't think it's random.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the recall goes down.
I think also you're like, something that I've been thinking about before is like, people have done these things where they're like, oh, we just like intervene a little bit with the model and then it gets a lot better for this task, right? But like, if we were to compile all these things together, like, is the model even going to retain any of that, right? Like, if you have this like giant script for content moderation, like, it's like, it can't do, you know what I mean? I'm kind of like,
One context models may be able to. I wouldn't say that it needs. So.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you never know what's gonna happen in a year. Right?
And some approaches like they have like a back setup on browser prompts where like try to retrieve the the rules of the content moderation like advising guide that is most relevant for the input instance and just put that into the model.
I would, and in terms of next steps, future directions, I think that the analysis chain of thought, if you're claiming this as like a very positive step forward, is going to be very interesting, especially for like smaller identity groups. How often does the chain of thought get things wrong? And what does that reasoning thread even look like? Because I feel like that's there. Like it seems promising, but that can also seem like a lot of problems with that setup.
Yeah. Wait. First of all, this is really helpful. Thank you. Second of all, in another project that we're doing right now that looks at like AAP dialect bias and emotion detection, something we're gonna do is get the like model to provide the chain of thought and then like actually get annotators to like score those chains of thoughts, right? About like how reasonable they even are. Which I'm really excited about. But yeah, that could be really interesting. And also using like RAG as a way to like incorporate, like I'm wondering if there's like some kind of way to be like, oh, we're seeing like this like a presence of this dialect, maybe like, oh, I guess we should go into this RAG and take a sample to like lead it. That seems like that could be really cool and then interesting. Cool.
Yeah, I think in error analysis, I feel like no one does error analysis of chain of thoughts, and that could be like super helpful for the community.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's totally this trend, right, of like model A fixes model B, right? And like with like very limited human evaluation, and like that's something I'm definitely your hands been raised for so long. I'm so sorry.
So as a suggestion, like I've been working with text dependencies and for vision language models. So I was wondering on your 14th slide, you were saying for mentioning an example. Yeah, so the example that you have mentioned, like not all these something like that. So whether you mentioned like some of us are actually related them. So you are referring that the author who is present, like they are referring to themselves as well.
Yeah.
So I was wondering like if we can use some kind of dependency parsers to find out relation between the author and the people mentioned in the post and improve the results anyway.
That would be cool. That would be really cool. I'm writing that down.
So kind of a suggestion here. Follow on my thing about working with communities where, so when you're working with the, like trying to actually take an active step, you may want to tweak your whatever system you have so that you can say like, you know, I want very high precision things, right? So like for something like talks-about perspective, which I believe are like just trained classifiers that at the end of the day can give you an actual probability of their label. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in your with your GPT on Mistral things, you're actually like having a thing at the end of the day just spit out like, is this harmful or not, right? Like with your example with the COT.
I think we make it do.
Yeah, you say well, yeah. What is this? Harm zero mean harm.
No, we talked about this during my calls, but then I had already submitted the paper, so I didn't change it. But we did have the model give a number from 0 to 1.
Oh, that's garbage.
And then we like capped it, right? Yeah.
I don't believe any kind of generated number like that. I don't believe an actual categorical or a model probability of one label versus another. So
yeah,
operationalization of what I'm saying is to get I mean, you can do it, right? Like you can obviously say like, you know, give us a score and only take scores that are just, you're not getting an actual probability distribution from that.
Right.
So being able to take what you've got from this and then from the chain of thought, et cetera, and then use that to actually be able to vary your precision levels. Like to be able to have a knob where you really can say, where you're able to classify as harmful or not harmful, right? Where you can adjust the precision level, and that precision level adjustment according to whatever your model thinks really does correlate well with whether you're actually being able to classify high precision or not.
And that's to the end of using the model as like an intermediate step for actual models.
Well, I think so. I think you know, just saying like, oh, basically you're in a mode right now where you if it's greater than 50%, essentially it says it's harmful, right?
Yeah.
And like that's fine, but like if you want to have a use case where like we're gonna let stuff go, but if we say it's harmful, it's definitely gonna be harmful.
Yeah.
Right? Like that is some kind of additional use case for that.
I think we did like 0.7, and I think that is. Yeah, that would have been really cool actually to like plot it like almost in like a ROC kind of style of like that's how we cool. That would be cool.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to time. Are there any other questions? Oh, Alex, yes.
Yeah, so I'm like really fascinated in general by like content moderation in like censorship states like China, where we I kind of want to maybe, I want to call it a devil's advocate argument, but like in China, when moderation happens, we see language evolution, and we see the evolution of symbols that are designed to like evade censors. So I was wondering if you could talk about the harm of moderation that is not exactly accurate, especially in the context of like maybe the in-group's language will evolve in a way that will adjust to the censor. I mean, language is and language is evolving, right? So like, what does harm mean in this context?
Yeah. I feel like that is just a huge ongoing research area. So I can't necessarily like speak to that. I will say in other work we've been doing, specifically with like eating disorder communities online, the like prominence of like content moderation invaders is insane, right? Like people will use like, we'll say like Ed not Sheeran, right? Because like it's like all those it's really insane. And also that's a question I've been having of like if we did want to like consider slurs with like certain like an asterisk or an and, right? Like or something like that, like at what perturbations could you actually consider? What are like the ones actually being used? Like, does it need to be manually compiled? Like, can we iteratively do it? And like, if we iteratively do it at one point, can you just not deal with the work? You know what I mean? I'm like, that is something where I'm like, great question. What do you think?
We do have a Zoom question from Mazine. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, thanks. Like this was fantastic. Thank you for presenting. When we look at some of the examples where it out as harmful, you spoke about like for certain subgroups it was harder to find explicit slurs. And this kind of like hyper visibility versus invisibility with different queer subgroups. And I'm wondering if there's any of that in terms of which slurs or which, depending on the group targeted, these are harder to find it, and whether that could map to kind of our understanding as queer people of, you know, which groups are hyper visible and which groups are more invisible.
Yeah, no, for real though. I couldn't hear the like second half of the question very much. But I don't know, I think that was a really, I think it's an interesting comment, right? Like what we don't see a lot of representation of within these slurs are like AFAB people and non-binary people, right? But like we see a lot of like trans femme representation, right? And like actually also we didn't even show it, but like in terms of like the slurs themselves, they like had their whole hierarchy of like what slurs models wouldn't budge on and which ones like they were fine to like say like, okay, fine, this is not offensive, specifically with like the F slur and D slur, which like have similar functions sort of, right? And similar histories. Like the F slur models were like, this is unacceptable and like would not budge, versus the D slur, you just like had to poke it once and it would be like, okay, fine, like anyone can say that now, and you're like, wait, that's not so. Yeah, there's like so much there. Also, we are at 12 o'clock.
Yeah, I think other questions can definitely probably go offline because I do want to keep us running on time. But thank you so much for coming today to present, Becca. We're really grateful for your perspective on this. So thanks very much.